Hiroshima by John Hersey, Chapter 3. Details are being investigated. Early in the evening of the day the bomb exploded, a Japanese naval launch moved slowly up and down the 7 rivers of Hiroshima. It stopped here and there to make an announcement. Alongside the crowded sands pits on which hundreds of wounded lay, at the bridges on which others were crowded, and eventually, as twilight fell, opposite Asano Park. A young officer stood up in the launch and shouted through a megaphone, "Be patient. A naval hospital ship is coming to take care of you." The sight of the ship-shaped launch against the background of the havoc across the river, the unruffled young man in his neat uniform, above all the promise of medical help, the first word of possible succor anyone had heard in nearly 12 awful hours, cheered the people in the park tremendously. Mrs. Nakamura settled her family for the night with the assurance that a doctor would come and stop their retching. Mr. Tanimoto resumed ferrying the wounded across the river. Father Kleinsorg lay down and said the Lord's Prayer and a Hail Mary to himself and fell right asleep. But no sooner had he dropped off than Mrs. Murata, the conscientious mission housekeeper, shook him and said, "Father Kleinsorg, did you remember to repeat your evening prayers?" He answered rather grumpily, "Of course," and he tried to go back to sleep but could not. This, apparently, was just what Mrs. Murata wanted. She began to chat with the exhausted priest. One of the questions she raised was when he thought the priest from the novitiate, for whom he had sent a messenger in mid-afternoon, would arrive to evacuate Father Superior LaSalle and Father Schaeffer. The messenger Father Kleinsorg had sent, the theological student who had been living at the mission house, had arrived at the novitiate in the hills about 3 miles out at 4:30. The 16 priests there had been doing rescue work in the outskirts. They had worried about their colleagues in the city, but had not known how or where to look for them. Now they hastily made 2 litters out of poles and boards, and the student led 6 of them back into the devastated area. They worked their way along the Oda above the city. Twice the heat of the fire forced them into the river. At Masasa Bridge, they encountered a long line of soldiers making a bizarre forced march away from the Chugogu Regional Army headquarters in the center of the town. All were grotesquely burned, and they supported themselves with staves or leaned on one another. Sick, burned horses, hanging their heads, stood on the bridge. When the rescue party reached the park, it was after dark, and progress was made extremely difficult by the tangle of fallen trees of all sizes that had been knocked down by the whirlwind that afternoon. At last, not long after Mrs. Murata asked her question, they reached their friends and gave them wine and strong tea. The priests discussed how to get Father Schaeffer and Father LaSalle out to the novitiate. They were afraid that blundering through the park with them would jar them too much on the wooden litters, and that the wounded men would lose too much blood. Father Kleinsorg thought of Mr. Tanimoto and his boat and called out to him on the river. When Mr. Tanimoto reached the bank, he said he would be glad to take the injured priests and their bearers upstream to where they could find a clear roadway. The rescuers put Father Schaeffer onto one of the stretchers and lowered it into the boat, and 2 of them went aboard with it. Mr. Tanimoto, who still had no oars, poled the punt upstream. About half an hour later, Mr. Tanimoto came back and excitedly asked the remaining priests to help him rescue 2 children he had seen standing up to their shoulders in the river. A group went out and picked them up. 2 young girls who had lost their family and were both badly burned. The priest stretched them on the ground next to Father Kleinsorg and then embarked Father LaSalle. Father Seislich thought he could make it out to the novitiate on foot, so he went aboard with the others. Father Kleinsorg was too feeble. He decided to wait in the park until the next day. He asked the men to come back with a handcart so that they could take Mrs. Nakamura and her sick children to the novitiate. Mr. Tanimoto shoved off again. As the boatload of priests moved slowly upstream, they heard weak cries for help. A woman's voice stood out especially. "There are people here about to be drowned. Help us, the water is rising." The sounds came from one of the sands pits, and those in the punt could see, in the reflected light of the still burning fires, a number of wounded people lying at the edge of the river, already partly covered by the flooding tide. Mr. Tanimoto wanted to help them, but the priests were afraid that Father Schaeffer would die if they didn't hurry, and they urged their ferryman along. He dropped them where he had put Father Schaeffer down, and then started back alone toward the sands pit. The night was hot, and it seemed even hotter because of the fires against the sky, but the younger of the two girls Mr. Tanimoto and the priests had rescued complained to Father Kleinsorg that she was cold. He covered her with his jacket. She and her older sister had been in the salt water of the river for a couple of hours before being rescued. The younger one had huge raw flash burns on her body. The salt water must have been excruciatingly painful to her. She began to shiver heavily and again said it was cold. Father Kleinsorg borrowed a blanket from someone nearby and wrapped her up, but she shook more and more and said again, "I am so cold," and then she suddenly stopped shivering and was dead. Mr. Tanimoto found about 20 men and women on the sands pit. He drove the boat onto the bank and urged them to get aboard. They did not move, and he realized that they were too weak to lift themselves. He reached down and took a woman by the hands, but her skin slipped off in huge glove-like pieces. He was so sickened by this that he had to sit down for a moment. Then he got out into the water, and though a small man, lifted several of the men and women who were naked into his boat. Their backs and breasts were clammy, and he remembered uneasily that the great burns he had seen during the day had been like, yellow at first, then red and swollen, with the skin sloughed off, and finally, in the evening, suppurated and smelly. With the tide risen, his bamboo pole was now too short, and he had to paddle most of the way across with it. On the other side, at a higher spit, he lifted the slimy living bodies out and carried them up the slope away from the tide. He had to keep consciously repeating to himself, "These are human beings." It took him 3 trips to get them all across the river. When he had finished, he decided he had to have a rest, and he went back to the park. As Mr. Tanimoto stepped up the dark bank, he tripped over someone, and someone else said angrily, "Look out, that's my hand." Mr. Tanimoto, ashamed of hurting wounded people, embarrassed at being able to walk upright, suddenly thought of the naval hospital ship, which had not come. It never did. And he had for a moment a feeling of blind, murderous rage at the crew of the ship, and then at all doctors. Why didn't they come to help these people? Dr. Fuji lay in dreadful pain throughout the night on the floor of his family's roofless house on the edge of the city. By the light of a lantern, he had examined himself and found left clavicle fractured, multiple abrasions and lacerations of face and body, including deep cuts on the chin, back, and legs, extensive contusions on chest and trunk, a couple of ribs possibly fractured. Had he not been so badly hurt, he might have been at Asano Park assisting the wounded. By nightfall, 10,000 victims of the explosion had invaded the Red Cross hospital, and Dr. Sasaki, worn out, was moving aimlessly and dully up and down the stinking corridors with wads of bandage and bottles of mercurochrome, still wearing the glasses he had taken from the wounded nurse, binding up the worst cuts as he came to them. Other doctors were putting compresses of saline solution on the worst burns. That was all they could do. After dark, they worked by the light of the city's fires and by candles the 10 remaining nurses held for them. Dr. Sasaki had not looked outside the hospital all day. The scene inside was so terrible and so compelling that it had not occurred to him to ask any questions about what had happened beyond the windows and doors. Ceilings and partitions had fallen. Plaster, dust, blood, and vomit were everywhere. Patients were dying by the hundreds, but there was nobody to carry away the corpses. Some of the hospital staff distributed biscuits and rice balls, but the charnel house smell was so strong that few were hungry. By 3 o'clock the next morning, after 19 straight hours of his gruesome work, Dr. Sasaki was incapable of dressing another wound. He and some other survivors of the hospital staff got straw mats and went outdoors. Thousands of patients and hundreds of dead were in the yard and on the driveway, and hurried around behind the hospital and lay down in hiding to snatch some sleep. But within an hour, wounded people had found them. A complaining circle formed around them. "Doctors, help us. How can you sleep?" Dr. Sasaki got up again and went back to work. Early in the day, he thought for the first time of his mother at their country home in Mukaihara, 30 miles from town. He usually went home every night. He was afraid she would think he was dead. Near the spot upriver to which Mr. Tanimoto had transported the priests, there sat a large case of rice cakes, which a rescue party had evidently brought for the wounded lying thereabouts, but hadn't distributed. Before evacuating the wounded priests, the others passed the cakes around and helped themselves. A few minutes later, a band of soldiers came up, and an officer, hearing the priests speaking a foreign language, drew his sword and hysterically asked who they were. One of the priests calmed him down and explained that they were Germans, allies. The officer apologized and said that there were reports going around that American parachutists had landed. The priests decided that they should take Father Schaeffer first. As they prepared to leave, Father Superior LaSalle said he felt awfully cold. One of the Jesuits gave up his coat, another his shirt. They were glad to wear less in the muggy night. The stretcher bearers started out. The theological student led the way and tried to warn the others of obstacles, but one of the priests got a foot tangled in some telephone wire and tripped and dropped his corner of the litter. Father Schaeffer rolled off, lost consciousness, came to, and then vomited. The bearers picked him up and went on with him to the edge of the city, where they had arranged to meet a relay of other priests, left him with them, and turned back and got the Father Superior. The wooden litter must have been terribly painful for Father LaSalle, in whose back sores of tiny particles of window glass were embedded. Near the edge of town, the group had to walk around an automobile burned and squatting on the narrow road, and the bearers on one side, unable to see their way in the darkness, fell into a deep ditch. Father LaSalle was thrown onto the ground, and the litter broke in two. One priest went ahead to get a handcart from the novitiate, but he soon found one beside an empty house and wheeled it back. The priest lifted Father LaSalle into the cart and pushed him over the bumpy road the rest of the way. The rector of the novitiate, who had been a doctor before he entered the religious order, cleaned the wounds of the two priests and put them to bed between clean sheets, and they thanked God for the care they had received. Thousands of people had nobody to help them. Miss Sasaki was one of them, abandoned and helpless under the crude lean-to in the courtyard of the tin factory, beside the woman who had lost a breast and the man whose burned face was scarcely a face any more. She suffered awfully that night from the pain in her broken leg. She did not sleep at all, neither did she converse with her sleepless companions. In the park, Mrs. Murata kept Father Kleinsorg awake all night by talking to him. None of the Nakamura family were able to sleep either. The children, in spite of being very sick, were interested in everything that happened. They were delighted when one of the city's gas storage tanks went up in a tremendous burst of flame. Toshio, the boy, shouted to the others to look at the reflection in the river. Mr. Tanimoto, after his long run and his many hours of rescue work, dozed uneasily. When he awoke in the first light of dawn, he looked across the river and saw that he had not carried the festered, limp bodies high enough on the sand spit the night before. The tide had risen above where he had put them. They had not had the strength to move. They must have drowned. He saw a number of bodies floating in the river. Early that day, August 7th, the Japanese radio broadcast for the first time a succinct announcement that very few, if any, of the people most concerned with its content, the survivors in Hiroshima, happened to hear. Hiroshima suffered considerable damage as the result of an attack by a few B-29s. It is believed that a new type of bomb was used. The details are being investigated. Nor is it probable that any of the survivors happened to be tuned in on a shortwave rebroadcast of an extraordinary announcement by the President of the United States, which identified the new bomb as atomic. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It had more than 2,000 times the blast power of the British Grand Slam, which is the largest bomb ever yet used in the history of warfare. Those victims who were able to worry at all about what had happened thought of it and discussed it in more primitive, childish terms. Gasoline sprinkled from an airplane, maybe, or some combustible gas, or a big cluster of incendiaries, or the work of parachutists. But even if they had known the truth, most of them were too busy or too weary or too badly hurt to care that they were the objects of the first great experiment in the use of atomic power, which, as the voices on the shortwave shouted, no country except the United States, with its industrial know-how, its willingness to throw $2 billion gold dollars into an important wartime gamble, could possibly have developed. Mr. Tanimoto was still angry at doctors. He decided that he would personally bring one to Asano Park by the scruff of the neck if necessary. He crossed the river, went past the Shinto shrine where he had met his wife for a brief moment the day before, and walked to the East Parade Ground. Since this had long before been designated as an evacuation area, he thought he would find an aid station there. He did find one, operated by an Army medical unit, but he also saw that its doctors were hopelessly overburdened, with thousands of patients sprawled among corpses across the field in front of it. Nevertheless, he went up to one of the Army doctors and said, as reproachfully as he could, "Why have you not come to Asano Park? You are badly needed there." Without even looking up from his work, the doctor said in a tired voice, "This is my station." "But there are many dying on the riverbank over there." "The first duty," the doctor said, "is to take care of the slightly wounded." "Why, when there are many who are heavily wounded on the riverbank?" The doctor moved to another patient. "In an emergency like this," he said, as if he were reciting from a manual, "the first task is to help as many as possible, to save as many lives as possible. There is no hope for the heavily wounded. They will die. We can't bother with them." "That may be right from a medical standpoint," Mr. Tanimoto began, but then he looked out across the field, where the many dead lay close and intimate with those who were still living, and he turned away without finishing his sentence, angry now with himself. He didn't know what to do. He had promised some of the dying people in the park that he'd bring them medical aid. They might die feeling cheated. He saw a ration stand at one side of the field, and he went to it and begged some rice cakes and biscuits, and he took them back, in lieu of doctors, to the people in the park. The morning again was hot. Father Kleinsorg went to fetch water for the wounded in a bottle and a teapot he had borrowed. He had heard that it was possible to get fresh tap water outside Asano Park. Going through the rock gardens, he had to climb over and crawl under the trunks of fallen pine trees. He found he was weak. There were many dead in the gardens. At a beautiful moon bridge, he passed a naked living woman who seemed to have been burned from head to toe and was red all over. Near the entrance to the park, an army doctor was working, but the only medicine he had was iodine, which he painted over cuts, bruises, slimy burns, everything, and by now everything that he painted had pus on it. Outside the gate of the park, Father Kleinsorg found a faucet that still worked, part of the plumbing of a vanished house, and he filled his vessels and returned. When he had given the wounded the water, he made a second trip. This time the woman by the bridge was dead. On his way back with the water, he got lost on a detour around a fallen tree, and as he looked for his way through the woods, he heard a voice ask from the underbrush, "Have you anything to drink?" He saw a uniform. Thinking there was just one soldier, he approached with the water. When he had penetrated the bushes, he saw there were about 20 men, and they were all in exactly the same nightmarish state. Their faces were wholly burned. Their eye sockets were hollow. The fluid from their melted eyes had run down their cheeks. They must have had their faces upturned when the bomb went off. Perhaps they were anti-aircraft personnel. Their mouths were mere swollen, pus-covered wounds, which they could not bear to stretch enough to admit the spout of the teapot. So Father Kleinsorg got a large piece of grass and drew out the stem so as to make a straw, and gave them all water to drink that way. One of them said, "I can't see anything." Father Kleinsorg answered as cheerfully as he could, "There's a doctor at the entrance to the park. He's busy now, but he'll come soon and fix your eyes, I hope." Since that day, Father Kleinsorg has thought back to how queasy he had once been at the sight of pain, how someone else's cut finger used to make him turn faint. Yet there in the park he was so benumbed that immediately after leaving this horrible sight, he stopped on a path by one of the pools and discussed with a lightly wounded man whether it would be safe to eat the fat, 2-foot carp that floated dead on the surface of the water. They decided, after some consideration, that it would be unwise. Father Kleinsorg filled the containers a third time and went back to the riverbank. There, amid the dead and dying, he saw a young woman with a needle and thread mending her kimono, which had been slightly torn. Father Kleinsorg joshed her. "My, but you're a dandy," he said. She laughed. He felt tired and lay down. He began to talk with 2 engaging children whose acquaintance he had made the afternoon before. He learned that their name was Karaoka. The girl was 13, the boy 5. The girl had been just about to set out for a barber shop when the bomb fell. As the family started for Asano Park, their mother decided to turn back for some food and extra clothing. They became separated from her in the crowd of fleeing people, and they had not seen her since. Occasionally they stopped suddenly in their perfectly cheerful playing and began to cry for their mother. It was difficult for all the children in the park to sustain the sense of tragedy. Toshio Nakamura got quite excited when he saw his friend Saichi Sato riding up the river in a boat with his family, and he ran to the bank and waved and shouted, "Sato, Sato." The boy turned his head and shouted, "Who's that?" "Nakamura." "Hello, Toshio. Are you all safe?" "Yes. What about you?" "Yes, we're all right. My sisters are vomiting, but I'm fine." Father Kleinsorg began to be thirsty in the dreadful heat, and he did not feel strong enough to go for water again. A little before noon, he saw a Japanese woman handing something out. Soon she came to him and said in a kindly voice, "These are tea leaves. Chew them, young man, and you won't feel thirsty." The woman's gentleness made Father Kleinsorg suddenly want to cry. For weeks he had been feeling oppressed by the hatred of foreigners that the Japanese seemed increasingly to show, and he had been uneasy even with his Japanese friends. The stranger's gesture made him a little hysterical. Around noon, the priest arrived from the novitiate with the handcart. They had been to the site of the mission house in the city and had retrieved some suitcases that had been stored in the air raid shelter, and had also picked up the remains of melted holy vessels and the ashes of the chapel. They now packed Father Kleinsword's papier-mâché suitcase and the things belonging to Mrs. Murata and the Nakamuras into the cart, put the two Nakamura girls aboard, and prepared to start out. Then one of the Jesuits, who had been a practical turn of mind, remembered that they had been notified some time before that if they suffered property damage at the hands of the enemy, they could enter a claim for compensation with the prefectural police. The holy men discussed this matter there in the park with the wounded as silent as the dead around them, and decided that Father Kleinsword, as a former resident of the destroyed mission, was the one to enter the claim. So as the others went off with the handcart, Father Kleinsword said goodbye to the Carioca children and trudged to a police station. Fresh, clean, uniformed policemen from another town were in charge, and a crowd of dirty and disarrayed citizens crowded around them, mostly asking after lost relatives. Father Kleinsword filled out a claim form and started walking through the center of the town on his way to Nagatsuka. It was then that he first realized the extent of the damage. He passed block after block of ruins, and even after all he had seen in the park, his breath was taken away. By the time he reached the novitiate, he was sick with exhaustion. The last thing he did as he fell into bed was request that someone go back for the motherless Carioca children. Altogether, Miss Sasaki was left 2 days and 2 nights under the piece of propped-up roofing with her crushed leg and her 2 unpleasant comrades. Her only diversion was when men came to the factory air raid shelters, which she could see from under one corner of her shelter, and hauled corpses up out of them with ropes. Her leg became discolored, swollen, and putrid. All that time she went without food and water. On the 3rd day, August 8th, some friends who supposed she was dead came to look for her body and found her. They told her that her mother, father, and baby brother, who at the time of the explosion were in the Tamura Pediatric Hospital where the baby was a patient, had all been given up as certainly dead, since the hospital was totally destroyed. Her friends then left her to think that piece of news over. Later, some men picked her up by the arms and legs and carried her quite a distance to a truck. For about an hour, the truck moved over a bumpy road, and Miss Sasaki, who had become convinced that she was dulled to pain, discovered that she was not. The men lifted her out at a relief station in the section of Inakuchi, where 2 army doctors looked at her. The moment one of them touched her wound, she fainted. She came to in time to hear them discuss whether or not to cut off her leg. One said there was gas gangrene in the lips of the wound and predicted she would die unless they amputated, and the other said that was too bad because they had no equipment with which to do the job. She fainted again. When she recovered consciousness, she was being carried somewhere on a stretcher. She was put aboard a launch which went to the nearby island of Hiroshima, and she was taken to a military hospital there. Another doctor examined her and said that she did not have gas gangrene, though she did have a fairly ugly compound fracture. He said quite coldly that he was sorry, but this was a hospital for operative surgical cases only, and because she had no gangrene, she would have to return to Hiroshima that night. But then the doctor took her temperature, and what he saw on the thermometer made him decide to let her stay. That day, August 8th, Father Seislich went into the city to look for Mr. Fukai, the Japanese secretary of the diocese, who had ridden unwillingly out of the flaming city on Father Kleinsword's back and then had run back crazily into it. Father Seislich started hunting in the neighborhood of Sakai Bridge, where the Jesuits had last seen Mr. Fukai. He went to the East Parade Ground, the evacuation area to which the secretary might have gone, and looked for him among the wounded and dead there. He went to the prefectural police and made inquiries. He could not find any trace of the man. Back at the novitiate that evening, the theological student, who had been rooming with Mr. Fukai at the mission house, told the priest that the secretary had remarked to him during an air raid alarm one day not long before the bombing, "Japan is dying. If there is a real air raid here in Hiroshima, I want to die with our country." The priest concluded that Mr. Fukai had run back to immolate himself in the flames. They never saw him again. At the Red Cross Hospital, Dr. Sasaki worked for 3 straight days with only 1 hour's sleep. On the 2nd day, he began to sew up the worst cuts, and right through the following night and all the next day, he stitched. Many of the wounds were festered. Fortunately, someone had found intact a supply of narukapon, a Japanese sedative, and he gave it to many who were in pain. Word went around among the staff that there must have been something peculiar about the great bomb, because on the 2nd day, the vice chief of the hospital went down in the basement to the vault where the X-ray plates were stored and found the whole stock exposed as they lay. That day, a fresh doctor and 10 nurses came in from the city of Yamaguchi with extra bandages and antiseptics, and the third day, another physician and a dozen more nurses arrived from Matsui. Yet, there were still only 8 doctors for 10,000 patients. In the afternoon of the third day, exhausted from his foul tailoring, Dr. Sasaki became obsessed with the idea that his mother thought he was dead. He got permission to go to Mukaihara. He walked out to the first suburbs, beyond which the electric train service was still functioning, and reached home late in the evening. His mother said she had known he was all right all along. A wounded nurse had stopped by to tell her. He went to bed and slept for 17 hours. Before dawn on August 8th, someone entered the room at the novitiate where Father Kleinsorg was in bed, reached up to the hanging light bulb, and switched it on. The sudden flood of light pouring in on Father Kleinsorg's half-sleep brought him leaping out of bed, braced for a new concussion. When he realized what had happened, he laughed confusedly and went back to bed. He stayed there all day. On August 9th, Father Kleinsorg was still tired. The rector looked at his cuts and said they were not even worth dressing, and if Father Kleinsorg kept them clean, they would heal in 3 or 4 days. Father Kleinsorg felt uneasy. He could not yet comprehend what he had been through, as if he were guilty of something awful. He felt he had to go back to the scene of the violence he had experienced. He got up out of bed and walked into the city. He scratched for a while in the ruins of the mission house, but he found nothing. He went to the sites of a couple of schools and asked after people he knew. He looked for some of the city's Japanese Catholics, but he found only fallen houses. He walked back to the novitiate, stupefied and without any new understanding. At 2 minutes after 11 o'clock on the morning of August 9th, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. It was several days before the survivors of Hiroshima knew they had company, because the Japanese radio and newspapers were being extremely cautious on the subject of the strange weapon. On August 9th, Mr. Tanimoto was still working in the park. He went to the suburb of Ushida, where his wife was staying with friends, and got a tent which he had stored there before the bombing. He now took it to the park and set it up as a shelter for some of the wounded who could not move or be moved. Whatever he did in the park, he felt he was being watched by the 20-year-old girl, Mrs. Kamai, his former neighbor, whom he had seen on the day the bomb exploded, with her dead baby daughter in her arms. She kept the small corpse in her arms for 4 days, even though it began smelling bad on the second day. Once Mr. Tanimoto sat with her for a while, and she told him that the bomb had buried her under their house with the baby strapped to her back, and that when she had dug herself free, she had discovered that the baby was choking, its mouth full of dirt. With her little finger, she had carefully cleaned out the infant's mouth, and for a time the child had breathed normally and seemed all right. Then suddenly it had died. Mrs. Kamai also talked about what a fine man her husband was, and again urged Mr. Tanimoto to search for him. Since Mr. Tanimoto had been all through the city the first day and had seen terribly burned soldiers from Kamai's post, the Chigogu Regional Army Headquarters, everywhere, he knew it would be impossible to find Kamai, even if he were living, but of course he didn't tell her that. Every time she saw Mr. Tanimoto, she asked whether he had found her husband. Once he tried to suggest that perhaps it was time to cremate the baby, but Mrs. Kamai only held it tighter. He began to keep away from her, but whenever he looked at her, she was staring at him, and her eyes asked the same question. He tried to escape her glance by keeping his back turned to her as much as possible. The Jesuits took about 50 refugees into the exquisite chapel of the novitiate. The rector gave them what medical care he could, mostly just the cleaning away of pus. Each of the Nakamuras was provided with a blanket and a mosquito net. Mrs. Nakamura and her younger daughter had no appetite and ate nothing. Her son and other daughter ate and lost each meal they were offered. On August 10th, a friend, Mrs. Osaki, came to see them and told them that her son Hideo had been burned alive in the factory where he worked. This Hideo had been a kind of hero to Toshio, who had often gone to the plant to watch him run his machine. That night, Toshio woke up screaming. He had dreamed that he had seen Mrs. Osaki coming out of an opening in the ground with her family, and then he saw Hideo at his machine, a big one with a revolving belt, and he himself was standing beside Hideo, and for some reason this was terrifying. On August 10th, Father Kleinsorg, having heard from someone that Dr. Fuji had been injured and that he had eventually gone to the summer house of a friend of his named Akuma in the village of Fukawa, asked Father Seislich if he would go and see how Dr. Fuji was. Father Seislich went to Masasa Station outside Hiroshima, rode for 20 minutes on an electric train, and then walked for an hour and a half in a terribly hot sun to Mr. Okuma's house, which was beside the Oda River at the foot of a mountain. He found Dr. Fuji sitting in a chair in a kimono, applying compresses to his broken collarbone. The doctor told Father Seislich about having lost his glasses and said that his eyes bothered him. He showed the priest huge blue and green stripes where beams had bruised him. He offered the Jesuit first a cigarette and then whiskey, though it was only 11 in the morning. Father Seislich thought it would please Dr. Fuji if he took a little, so he said yes. A servant brought some Suntory whiskey, and the Jesuit, the doctor, and the host had a very pleasant chat. Mr. Okuma had lived in Hawaii, and he told him some things about Americans. Dr. Fuji talked a bit about the disaster. He said that Mr. Okuma and a nurse had gone into the ruins of his hospital and brought back a small safe which he had moved into his air raid shelter. This contained some surgical instruments, and Dr. Fuji gave Father Seislich a few pairs of scissors and tweezers for the rector at the novitiate. Father Seislich was bursting with some inside dope he had, but he waited until the conversation turned naturally to the mystery of the bomb. Then he said he knew what kind of bomb it was. He had the secret on the best authority, that of a Japanese newspaper man who had dropped in at the novitiate. The bomb was not a bomb at all. It was a kind of fine magnesium powder sprayed over the whole city by a single plane, and it exploded when it came into contact with the live wires of the city power system. That means, Dr. Fuji, perfectly satisfied, since after all the information came from a newspaper man, that it can only be dropped on big cities and only in the daytime when the tram lines and so forth are in operation. After 5 days of ministering to the wounded in the park, Mr. Tanimoto returned on August 11th to his parsonage and dug around in the ruins. He retrieved some diaries and church records that had been kept in books and were only charred around the edges, as well as some cooking utensils and pottery. While he was at work, a Miss Tanaka came and said that her father had been asking for him. Mr. Tanimoto had reason to hate her father, the retired shipping company official who, though he made a great show of his charity, was notoriously selfish and cruel, and who, just a few days before the bombing, had said openly to several people that Mr. Tanimoto was a spy for the Americans. Several times he had derided Christianity and called it un-Japanese. At the moment of the bombing, Mr. Tanaka had been walking in the street in front of the city's radio station. He received serious flash burns, but he was able to walk home. He took refuge in his neighborhood association shelter and from there tried hard to get medical aid. He expected all the doctors of Hiroshima to come to him because he was so rich and so famous for giving his money away. When none of them came, he angrily set out to look for them. Leaning on his daughter's arm, he walked from private hospital to private hospital, but all were in ruins, and he went back and lay down in the shelter again. Now he was very weak and knew he was going to die. He was willing to be comforted by any religion. Mr. Tanimoto went to help him. He descended into the tomb-like shelter, and when his eyes were adjusted to the darkness, saw Mr. Tanaka, his face and arms puffed up and covered with pus and blood, and his eyes swollen shut. The old man smelled very bad, and he moaned constantly. He seemed to recognize Mr. Tanimoto's voice. Standing at the shelter stairway to get light, Mr. Tanimoto read loudly from a Japanese-language pocket Bible. For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past, and as a watch in the night. Thou carriest the children of men away as with a flood. They are as asleep. In the morning they are like grass which groweth up. In the morning it flourisheth and groweth up. In the evening it is cut down and withereth. For we are consumed by thine anger, and by thy wrath are we troubled. Thou hast set our iniquities before thee, our secret sins in the light of thy countenance. For all our days are passed away in thy wrath. We spend our years as a tale that is told. Mr. Tanaka died as Mr. Tanimoto read the psalm. On August 11th, word came to the Hiroshima Military Hospital that a large number of military casualties from the Chigogu Regional Army Headquarters were to arrive on the island that day, and it was deemed necessary to evacuate all civilian patients. Miss Sasaki, still running an alarmingly high fever, was put on a large ship. She lay out on deck with a pillow under her leg. There were awnings over the deck, but the vessel's course put her in the sunlight. She felt as if she were under a magnifying glass in the sun. Pus oozed out of her wound, and soon the whole pillow was covered with it. She was taken ashore at Hatsukaichi, a town several miles to the southwest of Hiroshima, and put in the Goddess of Mercy Primary School, which had been turned into a hospital. She lay there for several days before a specialist on fractures came from Kobe. By then, her leg was red and swollen up to her hip. The doctor decided he could not set the brakes. He made an incision and put in a rubber pipe to drain off the putrescence. At the novitiate, the motherless Karioka children were inconsolable. Father Cieslik worked hard to keep them distracted. He put riddles to them. He asked, "What is the cleverest animal in the world?" And after the 13-year-old girl had guessed the ape, the elephant, the horse, he said, "No, it must be the hippopotamus, because in Japanese that animal is kaba, the reverse of baka, stupid." He told Bible stories, beginning in the order of things with the creation. He showed them a scrapbook of snapshots taken in Europe. Nevertheless, they cried most of the time for their mother. Several days later, Father Cieslik started hunting for the children's family. First, he learned through the police that an uncle had been to the authorities in Kure, a city not far away, to inquire for the children. After that, he heard that an older brother had been trying to trace them through the post office in Ujina, a suburb of Hiroshima. Still later, he heard that the mother was alive and was on Goto Island off Nagasaki. And at last, by keeping a check on the Ujina post office, he got in touch with the brother and returned the children to their mother. About a week after the bomb dropped, a vague, incomprehensible rumor reached Hiroshima that the city had been destroyed by the energy released when atoms were somehow split in two. The weapon was referred to in this word-of-mouth report as Genshi Bakudan, the root characters of which can be translated as original child bomb. No one understood the idea or put any more credence in it than in the powdered magnesium and such things. Newspapers were being brought in from other cities, but they were still confining themselves to extremely general statements, such as Dome's assertion on August 12th, "There is nothing to do but admit the tremendous power of this inhuman bomb." Already, Japanese physicists had entered the city with Lauritsen electroscopes and near electrometers. They understood the idea all too well. On August 12th, the Nakamuras, all of them still rather sick, went to the nearby town of Kabi and moved in with Mrs. Nakamura's sister-in-law. The next day, Mrs. Nakamura, although she was too ill to walk much, returned to Hiroshima alone by electric car to the outskirts, by foot from there. All week at the novitiate, she had worried about her mother, brother, and older sister, who had lived in the part of town called Fukuro, and besides, she felt drawn by some fascination, just as Father Kleinsorg had been. She discovered that her family were all dead. She went back to Kabi so amazed and depressed by what she had seen and learned in the city that she could not speak that evening. A comparative orderliness, at least, began to be established at the Red Cross Hospital. Dr. Sasaki, back from his rest, undertook to classify his patients, who were still scattered everywhere, even on the stairways. The staff gradually swept up the debris. Best of all, the nurses and attendants started to remove the corpses. Disposal of the dead by decent cremation and enshrinement is a greater moral responsibility to the Japanese than adequate care of the living. Relatives identified most of the first day's dead in and around the hospital. Beginning on the second day, whenever a patient appeared to be moribund, a piece of paper with his name on it was fastened to his clothing. The corpse detail carried the bodies to a clearing outside, placed them on pyres of wood from ruined houses, burned them, put some of the ashes in envelopes intended for exposed x-ray plates, marked the envelopes with the names of the deceased, and piled them neatly and respectfully in stacks in the main office. In a few days, the envelopes filled one whole side of the impromptu shrine. In Kabi, on the morning of August 15th, 10-year-old Toshio Nakamura heard an airplane overhead. He ran outdoors and identified it with a professional eye as a B-29. "There goes Mr. B," he shouted. One of his relatives called out to him, "Haven't you had enough of Mr. B?" The question had a kind of symbolism. At almost that very moment, the dull, dispirited voice of Hirohito, the Emperor Tenno, was speaking for the first time in history over the radio. After pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we had decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. Mrs. Nakamura had gone to the city again to dig up some rice she had buried in her neighborhood association air raid shelter. She got it and started back for Kabi. On the electric car, quite by chance, she ran into her younger sister, who had not been in Hiroshima the day of the bombing. "Have you heard the news?" her sister asked. "What news?" "The war is over." "Don't say such a foolish thing, sister. But I heard it over the radio myself." And then in a whisper, "It was the Emperor's voice." "Oh," Ms. Nakamura said. She needed nothing more to make her give up thinking, in spite of the atomic bomb, that Japan still had a chance to win the war. In that case... Sometime later, in a letter to an American, Mr. Tanimoto described the events of that morning. "At the time of the post-war, the marvelous thing in our history happened. Our emperor broadcasted his own voice through radio directly to us, common people of Japan. August 15th, we were told that some news of great importance could be heard, and all of us should hear it. So I went to Hiroshima railway station. There sat a loudspeaker in the ruins of the station. Many civilians, all of them were in bondage, some being helped by shoulder of their daughters, some sustaining their injured feet by sticks. They listened to the broadcast, and when they came to realize the fact that it was the emperor, they cried with full tears in their eyes. What a wonderful blessing it is that Tenno himself call on us, and we can hear his own voice in person. We are thoroughly satisfied in such a great sacrifice." When they came to know the war was ended, that is, Japan was defeated, they, of course, were deeply disappointed, but followed after their emperor's commandment in calm spirit, making wholehearted sacrifice for the everlasting peace of the world, and Japan started her new way.